Crisis is a great motivator. We may be where we are today because we're an early adapter or adopter. In the late 80s and early 90s, we had two crises that came almost back to back. It's not that we hadn't had crises before, we had. Prior to that, nobody talked about them. We knew that some ministers just kind of disappeared and rumors abounded. But then there came the one that made the newspapers and the TV stations, when the pastor who was just 7 miles down the road from where I was pastoring in that era ended up convicted and sent to state prison for the molestation of several children. And then came the day when word came to all of us that a district superintendent had left the ministry. That gets your attention. And they were so public that we could ignore the issues no longer. And out of those terrible tragedies, the innocent lives so horribly harmed, careers lost, came a decision that makes me proud of my annual conference and the various bishops that have led it. Because rather than hiding heads in the sand, I was but a young pastor, much younger than today, in that era. Conscious decisions were made to learn from this, to begin to do appropriate education, to put policies in place, put procedures in place that would bring us into a new and better day. 1992 was when we seriously began to get organized. But two other motivators I want to call your attention, and one I've discovered is very little known. How many of you know that in 1993 a federal law was passed, the National Child Protection Act? How many of you know that? That's more than in several settings that I speak at. I heard about it after I became director of Connectional Ministries, and the General Counsel for the United Methodist Church came to our national meeting many years ago now, because I've been at that job 10 years, and said to us, folks, there's a law, and it does not exclude not-for-profits. Many federal laws do. They exclude churches, at least, if not other not-for-profits. She said, this one does not. And it says, anyone in America who works with children or youth must be appropriately trained, background checked, and prepared in those and other kinds of ways before they are ever to work with children or youth in the United States of America. We don't have a choice, folks. It's federal law, and it applies to us. And, of course, our denomination spoke as well. Our first policy for what today would be called safe sanctuaries actually predates the book. It was 1994. And it was called for us the Policy for Protection of Children and Youth. Applied at that time only to adults who worked with both children and youth at conference events. A committee was formed to implement the policy, curriculum was developed, forms were created, and an approval process was put in place. What about local churches? Well, they were encouraged to do the same, but not required. They could put their adults who work with children and youth through the conference process if they so chose, or they could create and implement their own program locally. And, as would happen anywhere, you form a conference committee to put all that in place to make it happen and encourage its adoption. Additional mandates. General Conference, 1996. At that point, Kansas East and West Conference agreed to work together on area policies on sexual ethics, and it took 3 attempts. Some of you know how that worked with Judicial Council. You pass the policy, you send it to Judicial Council, they turn it down. You revise it, you send it, they turn it down. We revised it a 3rd time, and 3rd time was charm, and it was approved. Upon the approval, COSRO and the General Council for the United Methodist Church agreed to come to Kansas and meet jointly with Kansas East and West because we had identical policies all written together and provide training for us on how to best implement those sexual ethics policies. At that point in 2001, in the spring, just before I became the Director of Connectional Ministries, a joint meeting they led that included people from COSRO, the Cabinet, the Board of Ordained Ministry, and other interested parties working in this field in our annual conference met and agreed to create what we call the Sexual Ethics Committee that they decided ought to be chaired by the new DCM. Welcome to your job. At the same time, it was discussed, now 7 years into safe sanctuaries, or as we have come to call it, safe and sacred space, we had encouraged 330 churches to implement this locally. We had achieved, after all those years, 5% compliance. And of those 5%, we found about half of those were skipping significant portions of what we thought was a reasonable effort, meaning they thought those background checks were just too darn much trouble or too darned expensive. And so we began to think about alternatives. And this is the one that a lot of you shake your heads at and either can't believe we did it or think it was not a wise decision. A petition came to annual conference in 2001 that would mandate every local church in our annual conference to participate in the conference's Safe and Sacred Space program with a deadline for total compliance of 18 months. Now, do you hear that? Every local church not doing their own thing or not doing nothing, but doing the conference mandated effort. Now, the petition passed by a fairly wide margin, but there is a reason. And that was, if you think about the calendar, that year was when the newspapers were filled almost daily, it felt like, and TV, news, media reporting constant cases, one after another, of clergy sexual abuse. At that time, primarily in the Roman Catholic Church, but not exclusively so. And the memory was still relatively fresh of those two horrendous cases that had so traumatized the Kansas East Conference, but 10 years before. That year at annual conference, or soon after, that Sexual Ethics Committee created a boilerplate version of a local church safe and sacred space policy. The superintendents, bless their hearts, agreed to help enforce it by expecting every church at every charge conference that fall to fill in the blanks and adopt it. A large number of instructors were trained so that every church had one close at hand so there could be no excuses that distance or lack of proper instruction would get in the way. Remember, we started in 1994, we're talking 2001. We had trained to that point and had 650 people certified to work with children and youth in the bounds of the conference. But in the next 18 months, 650 turned into 6,500. I read a lot of files. Compare that to the size of an annual conference. The average worship attendance in the Kansas East Conference then and now is approximately 32,000 people. 20% of the worship attendance in our annual conference was, by that date, trained, background checked, and certified. And it has grown fairly significantly since. Nancy will fill you in about that. How to coordinate. By 2002, we realized we needed to coordinate our efforts ever more significantly. We had a Safe and Sacred Space conference level committee, a Safe and Sacred Space local church implementation committee, a sexual ethics team. We had the Board of Ordained Ministry working in sexual ethics as well. We had COSRO working on advocates. And we got ourselves together and said there's got to be a better way. And at that point, the conference voted to empower the sexual ethics team to manage any and all of those programs. Members were added to the sexual ethics team from the Board of Ordained Ministry, from COSRO, a cabinet rep, the chancellor, people running the Safe and Sacred Space program, as well as 2 or 3 at-large members. All other committees were disbanded. Their job: sexual ethics training of clergy and lay professionals, safe and sacred space training and certification at all levels, training of advocates, training of the response team. Does staff assist? Oh, yes. The Director of Connectional Ministries was charged with chairing the committee and leading what we call our certification authority, that not only reads files and agrees whether or not to certify, but also receives complaints or allegations of wrongdoing. And our complaints and allegations run 10 to 1, 10 lay people being complained about, as opposed to 1 clergy in the Safe and Sacred Space program. We also have a staff person called the Consultant for Pastoral and Congregational Concerns. He is the one who had a heart attack recently and is unable to be present with us. His job description is twofold. He runs the Board of Ordained Ministries residency program and treats that as a prevention program, and not just about sexual ethics and boundary training, but in all the other kind of aspects you'd expect a residency program to address. But his other half-time hat that he wears is to be on call to the bishop and superintendents to go in as the lead of our response team in times of need or crisis. And as you could imagine, we have a 30-hour-a-week secretarial person in the conference office who manages all the paperwork, running the background checks, preparing the files to be read, and for renewals, should the file be absolutely clean, she has the authority to sign off on a renewal of certification. Is there resistance? There has been some, but amazingly far less than we feared, and that's the piece of hope I would encourage you to hang on to. Sometimes our fears are greater than reality. Many of the people in our pews, in their secular careers and lifestyles, work in areas where they do this as a part of their work every day. They go through training. They have background checks done. They know the importance of this. Oh yes, there'll always be some complainers. But I think sometimes we fear too much. Our greatest resistance came from folk whose programs use our facility but are not considered strictly church-related. Now, it's our preschools and daycares, it's our Boy Scout troops, some of those who've had the stronger resistance. What was our response to those? We began a dialogue with the local executive of the Boy Scout Council in Topeka, Kansas, where our conference office is located. And he had been complaining to us about our expectations of his scout leaders. He said, well, let me take a look at your curriculum. And we said, we'll be glad to look at yours. And then we scheduled a meeting where he would come, and we knew he was going to try to convince us to waive our requirements for Boy Scout pack and troop leaders in United Methodist Church chartered troops. But an interesting thing happened. He walked in the door and he blew us away. He said, you know, we don't have to have this conversation other than the fact that I need to tell you what I've done. I'm convinced now you have a far superior program to ours. I've been in touch with the National Scout Office, and they've issued you this letter. And it says it's issued to the executive of every Boy Scout council that overlaps your boundaries, and it says to them, if you have Cub Scout or Boy Scout packs or troops chartered in a United Methodist Church, please use the Kansas East Conference Safe and Sacred Space program. We will honor that and waive ours. A gift of God. That letter is on our website. Because anytime a scout leader complains, we refer them to their national office's letter, and the story's over. You've got a slide, and it's on your disc about daycares. I'll let that one go. We need to keep moving. Now, here's the question that came up the other day when I was talking about background checks in a workshop I led, but it's addressed here as well. Is there a risk in the conference assuming the certification of people in all the local churches? Aren't you opening yourselves up to terrible legal liability? What's your chancellor think about that? Well, we've had two chancellors span this era of history, and they've both agreed. When the federal law says we must, and when the Book of Discipline says we must, and if we let our churches slide by and don't enforce it, then we're just as legally liable for not. And in fact, would want you to know whenever we deny someone for certification in safe and sacred space, the chancellor is the last one to read the file and actually puts a letter in the file on her letterhead with her signature saying, I believe this person should be denied. And when we send the letter which she has approved, it says, after review of our certification authority and chancellor, you have been denied. Now, has that been tested in court? Yes. We were sued before we mandated every local church in one legal case for multi-millions. We've been sued once since the conference mandate in a multi-million-dollar case. I spent a year working for the bishop doing nothing but legal research of 20 years of history of our conference, of every pastor who was brought up on complaint and how it was disposed of, every sexual ethics and safe and sacred space training we had ever held, date, time, location, curriculum, speaker, and attendance record, and in-court testimony, the concerted efforts we had put forth to provide adequate training so blew things away that, in fact, the multi-million-dollar lawsuit basically went away. Are there some risks? There are risks if we don't. There are risks if we do. We've decided it's worth protecting our most vulnerable people in our churches, and that we would rather risk that direction than any other. Have we learned anything else in the process? And I'm about done with my portion. We had, out of that first court case, made a couple of changes. We used to renew certifications based solely on paperwork, meaning people reapply on paper, turn in some more references, re-release us to do background checks, and that was it. In the court case, it became apparent that it would be good to do retraining at recertification, and we now do that. And at retraining events or initial trainings, we give people more material to take home than we did in the early days. Then, as was mentioned earlier, at least in the South Central jurisdiction, many of you know in 2008 we got yet one more mandate, and that was a sexual ethics policy related to when laity are the perpetrators and clergy are the victim of misconduct. And that mandate came in the 2008 General Conference, and at conference in 2009, both Kansas East and West adopted a new policy in relation to that. We also expanded Safe and Sacred Space. It no longer talks just about people who work with children and youth, but we've talked now about vulnerable adults. For example, adults who happen to have what we sometimes call as a developmental disability. So many of our churches have those kinds of ministries and others, and so our policy now applies to that as well. Now here's one more last decision that we made. In Kansas, clergy are not mandatory reporters of child abuse or neglect. But our annual conference voted in, I didn't even list the year and I don't remember, it was sometime about 5 years ago, that the state may not require it, but our annual conference does. And so we chose to put that requirement on ourselves, and that is part of our pattern of work and life today. I'm going to turn it over to Nancy Brown.
So I'm glad to be here with you, and glad to share some information with you about our program. And as Gary mentioned, this is just one program. Listening to all of you, you have programs in various stages. Some of them you are probably way beyond ours. Some have online programs. Some are just starting and really don't have any programs. what I tried to do when I put this together was to give you them information that wherever stage you're at, you might glean some bits and pieces from this that you can use for your own, but also that any part of this you can take with you. And we have all of our information on our website, the workbook that we have, the training manual, and everything else that we do, and feel free to download that. I think it's in a PDF format, but if you want it and you want to change it, we'll send it to you in a Word document so you can even not have to retype everything if you want to do some of this. I do want to thank Gary. Gary has been so much involved in this program for so many years, but we also have a couple other people from Kansas who are currently involved, and some like Dan Heptis, who was involved from the very, very beginning. As Gary mentioned, this program evolved. This is not something that we just put together in one day and said we're done. This is something that's ongoing all the time. So thank you to all of them. I want to share what the program is. We are not talking right now about the sexual ethics program for clergy. We're talking strictly about safe sanctuaries or safe and sacred space. And it's a program that's in response to our own conference mandate that basically says we had to have one, that we would provide a training program. So that's what this particular program is. It's a face-to-face interactive 3-hour course. It used to be longer, but we shortened it, and I'm glad that we were able to do that in ways that made it more meaningful. It consists of a background check and a KBI check, the Kansas Bureau of Investigation check, and our social and rehabilitation services check. And you heard Gary, if you were in his workshop, talk about why we include all those kinds of things, and that is to get the best information that we possibly can. We require 2 references, one clergy and one lay. We have recertification every 4 years. We also have things on our website that we try and keep current if anything else comes up. We now have moved that to every 5 years. We've had to increase our fees for our program because our KBI checks increased. So we try to kind of keep everybody happy by saying, but just think, now you have 1 more year. But in reality, they have to be recertified, and the program has changed. It just kind of evolves, and there's some changes. So we don't do a separate recertification program. We were going to do that. We tried to do that. But it just required too much in paperwork, too much of our training instructors to do 2 classes, and we just realized that being recertified in a program every 5 years was certainly worth it. I need to give everybody credit in this room and people who have really been beneficial to us and helpful to us when we were writing our program. I need to single out Missouri, who was very instrumental when I first came on board in sharing their information with me, but also the Board of Discipleship and many, many other people. So you have a wonderful resource here with all the people that are here. And I'm glad that we're now starting to dialogue and use some of the other resources that we have. I already told you a little bit about what the policy is, and Gary shared with you about what the current policies are. I've included more information in the presentation, so when you go back home and look on your DVD, you can go back and pick up some of the things that I'm not going to talk about necessarily, but I'll flip through very quickly. I want to share with you what it is not. It is not an all-inclusive program. And it's very interesting because Terry and I do the training for instructors, and I read all the evaluations from everybody that comes through, and it's amazing to me how little people complain about the program itself. What they complain about is they really want more information. You know, can't you add more information about bullying? Can't you add more information about internet? Can't you add more information about cyber safety, et cetera? So we're finding that people want more information, not less information. It's not a adjustive and restoration program either, and that's another program that I think that we really need to consider in all of our conferences in our churches. But this basically is a training program in response to our youth protection policies. It does include resources and best practices, and you will have that information again if you go to our website and download the program. Just want to give you a little information about who we are as a conference, because you might be thinking, oh, well, that's Kansas or whatever. You know, we can't do things in our conference the same way they can. I just wanted to give you some statistics so you'll know. 5 districts, 324 churches, 72,000 members, 447 clergy. That's going to change, by the way. For those of you that don't know, we're in the process of a transition, and we are going to have one bishop for Kansas East, Kansas West, and Nebraska for 3 annual conferences. And so this bishop will be responsible for 17 districts, 1,070 churches, approximately 240,000 members, and over 1,000 clergy. So we are going from a relatively small district to a relatively large conference that will mean that we'll have to think about new ways, gratefully new ways of working together and combining some of our resources, and I'm just really, really excited about that. For the people that say, well, we can't do that in our conference, we don't have the staff, I just want to share with you that the program that we conduct is basically a volunteer program. Gary told you about the staff that we have, but we've been blessed with volunteers who feel very strongly about this program and who view this as our ministry and who commit a lot of time to that. We have 2 volunteer instructor coordinators. That's myself and Terry. And Terry, raise your hand so they can talk to you maybe later. Carrie came on board about 2 years ago after working with the Church of the Resurrection on staff, but we are both volunteers. We have 152 certified instructors that we have trained to go out and teach in their local churches. We have 7,327 current workers. We've trained over 13,000 people, just for your information. And Gary mentioned the 1 staff and the 1 staff consultant that we have. Current number of instructors, I shared with you 152, but I just want you to realize that they're broken down by district, and all of our certifications are open to everybody. So if you're a small church, you don't have anyone that can train in your church, or that's not their ministry, we post our trainings on the website, and anybody can come to any training anytime. This is not a church training specifically for that church. It is a conference program for all people in all churches. To be an instructor, you have to be 23 years of age. You must be a worker to be an instructor. So you have to go through the worker training and be a worker in the church before you're an instructor. And we have to get references from the clergy in the church in which they're going to serve. And then we also require a second reference as well. If you happen to be clergy, and by the way, we don't always encourage clergy to be instructors. We mandate that all clergy go through the program, but clergy move from church to church, as you know, and plus they have a variety of other responsibilities and duties. But we do have many clergy instructors who really want to be instructors, and we really value that as well. And in the case of a clergy instructor, they must then get the DS's permission. Where am I? Back up. They must be under appointment for 2 years, et cetera. And that sometimes is difficult when we have clergy moving from one conference to another, and obviously in cases we sometimes have to waive the requirements if we're in a certain time frame or whatever. But anyhow, we value every one of those instructors, and as I mentioned, most of them are all volunteers and commit their time 3 hours of the programs that they do. I'm just going to flip through some of these very quickly. Just to give you an idea of how many classes that we hold in our conference per year, we had 197 classes in 2009 and 194 in 2010, and we've had 7 instructor trainings, and we try and do those throughout the conference. As I mentioned, we have 7,327 certified workers, and the Church of the Resurrection obviously is a very large church, and we have in the Church of the Resurrection 1,530 certified workers in our church. Just an FYI, some people go through the processes, start it and don't complete it. I'm not always sure why, but again, we've trained over 13,000 people since the program started. We have 2 different courses, as you can imagine. We have the instructor course that Terry and I teach, and then we have the worker course, which we can also teach, but we will like to keep our roles basically with instructors and let others do the other things. And I already mentioned that it's open to other people. I just want to talk a little bit about our training materials. A variety of people in churches I've listened to, in conferences that I've listened to, you all talk about. Some of you have written programs, some of you don't. Some of you, when I've talked with you, you'll say, what are you talking about? But I want to share with you that how we put together our program was a program that could be used by anybody. We are all different individuals, and we're not all teachers. And when I was writing this program, I realized teaching is not my gift. And I took the instructor training program, and I'm going, oh, I'm not sure I can really do this. And kind of the format was confusing, so I offered, in my wisdom, to rewrite the program. And the program, that, as it was rewritten, was written for anybody to teach. So there are a lot of instructional materials in the program, so anyone can become an instructor. We also talk about anybody can be flexible in how they teach, but it's mandated that we all must teach the same material. Otherwise, like Gary said, if we go to court and somebody wants to know what a particular person heard or didn't hear, we can say, our program is consistent. This was taught. They were aware of this particular situation. So we mandate that everything in our program be taught by our instructors. We have a PowerPoint that we made available. Some people don't like PowerPoint, and some small churches don't have PowerPoint. We don't require that they use that. But we have it available. So we've tried to make the program as simple as possible, as easy as possible for our instructors. We also have a DVD that we do require them to use, the instructors to use, and it's called Reducing the Risk 3. I did not bring one. Some of you are familiar with that program because it used to be the only DVD that was out, and we have certain segments that we have asked them to use, and we find that there are excellent parts of that program, and I'll show you a little bit about, I'll read some of the titles of it in a minute for you. And we have a take-home workbook for everybody, which is right here, which is also on our website. We encourage them to download their own workbook before they come, complete the paperwork before they come. And so basically all the work is done for the instructor. They gather the materials and they send them in to the conference office. I want to just share with you a little bit about the program that I also mentioned. This is our training manual, and it looks pretty formidable, but in reality, there's a very short segment of the training that that's actually the training in the manual. The rest are resources, best practices, the forms, everything you ever everything you ever needed to become an instructor in the Kansas East Conference is right in this book. We had one extra copy I've already passed out, but as I've shared with you, it's on our website, and you're certainly welcome to download the program and use it in any way you would like to do so. The program is such that on the left side on your left side, is actually the content of the program, and on the side is the PowerPoint slides, so you can see exactly what we're saying in the PowerPoint slides. On the right side is supplemental material that you can add and write your own notes and anything else you want to share. But on the left side is exactly what they're taking home, what the workers are taking home. So as you're training, you can look and see exactly what they're looking at and what they're taking home. So it's a very simplified version. It sounds much more complicated. I'm making it much more complicated than it is, but it's really a very, very simple format, and I have it here, and if any of you'd like to see it, you're welcome to come up and take a look at it afterward. These are the segments. It's of the Reducing the Risk video that we ask the instructors to share, and you can see that it's the child protection and the foundation of your ministry. A lot of the work, instructors' work, is done for them through the viewing of this video, and we have found that this video has been very well accepted. It shares a victim's story, which is a very heartbreaking story. It talks about testimony of a sex offender. There's a round table, all valuable kinds of resources that you might not have in your church. We have these available in our district offices. We don't expect every church to buy one of these. We share it and actually mail it if it needs to be mailed. So it's another easy way to put together a program with minimum amount of money and resources. Again, the program components, we talked a little bit, Gary talked a little bit about the sexual ethics implementation team. I'm not going to go through all that, the certification authority, etc. I think you covered that too, Gary, the certification authority, so I won't go through all that. The denial process, I think he did share a little bit about that with you, and actually on our forms, the way that we have devised our forms is such that some people would immediately say, I don't think I'm ready to go through this. For instance, if there's a DUI in your background, there's some trigger questions and some things that hopefully will have people look at so they don't go through the certification process if they know that they can't fulfill the requirements of the certification. So you can look at our forms and see how we've actually devised that so people can self-select. Also, Gary didn't go too much into the denial process, but I will tell you that yes, we have denied people. We take this very seriously, that serving with children, youth, and adults with developmental disabilities, anybody in the vulnerable population, is a privilege, not a right. We have had people come back to us and say, you know I'm emotionally broken, and I know I've committed this or whatever, but I need to do this to heal. Well, this program is not in the business to heal people who are broken in that way. So we have denied people for a variety of reasons. And again, we find other places in the church for them to serve if they're at the state where they can do that. But we also don't apologize for denying people when they should be denied from serving in this program and protecting our children. Again, if there is a denial, it's confidential, and it goes only, the chancellor, as Gary mentioned, a letter goes to the clergy, so the clergy is aware that a denial will be made. Gary usually calls the person, or Frank now, so there's some dialogue about the reasons why or what's happened without revealing too much of the confidential information. But the church, the ministry areas in the church might not know this. So one of the things that we have asked our ministry areas to do when people come to work in their church, particularly in the large churches like the Church of the Resurrection, we ask them to actually copy the certification card and put it in their departmental file or the church's file in some way so they know that in a ministry area that person has been certified. Rather than and people who have been denied, in most cases, will find reasons not to serve in that ministry area. I mean, they don't broadcast that they've denied, nor do we, but they find other places to go or to serve, not necessarily with youth and children. Again, all records are kept confidential in our conference office, not in the local church's office. Churches sometimes do ask us if we will send them a list of who's been certified in their church if they haven't kept their own records, but we're really trying to encourage them to make sure that they have a copy of the certification card for every person that's serving in their church. Coordinator of instructors, these are the things that Terry and I do. Again, I think it's important to find the leaders in your conferences and in your churches that are willing and have a passion for this ministry. This is a ministry area for their volunteers, and don't deny them the joy of knowing that they're serving the Lord in this way. I'm going to go through some of this. Again, we are a coordinated approach to our safe and sacred space and our sexual ethics, and we serve on the implementation team, the sexual implementation team. Staff assistant, Gary already told you what she did. The local church responsibility, there still is obviously a local church responsibility. Why we have conducted the program and taken that responsibility for making sure that, for the training to be done, it's the local church's responsibility to do a variety of things, keeping the records, making sure that that their church council, and in my church, we require our church council members to be certified whether or not they work with children and youth. We feel it's extremely important for them to serve as ambassadors of the program. We require our staff to be trained down to the janitor because they have opportunities to be alone with children. And I will tell you, it's part of our DNA. So it's no longer an issue of saying, we don't have time for that, or we're not going to do this. It's just part of who we are, and it's an expectation. So we don't get the pushback that I hear from a lot of other places, because everybody basically is on board with this. And that's really one of the blessings now. 10 years ago, maybe 12, before we got a lot of the complaints and the publicity with the Catholic Church, there was a lot of pushback. You know, don't you trust me? I'm serving and you require me to do this. We don't get any of that now. It really, like Gary said, the most things that we get are people who are maybe the Boy Scouts who say, look, I've already been trained. We do get some questions from teachers saying, I've just gone through a background check. Do I have to do another one? Yes, because we don't keep background checks. They don't keep background checks. Yes, you have to do another background check. But they're minor complaints to what I'm sure we used to hear years and years ago. I'm not going to go through that. If there's any way we can say that we're successful, I think it's for some of the reasons that we've just outlined. It's because of the people that we've had willing to take on this process, willing to hear the complaints. People like Gary, who spent a year doing research. Winning that suit was a big plus for us when we didn't have to pay the whatever, hundred thousands of dollars of fees. But also the pastors and the clergy and the dedicated people, and the fact that we do a lot of work for the local churches. And it always is interesting to me when the local churches complain, and you kind of go, well, why don't you talk to your conference and see if they'll do the program for you. So those of you who are in conferences, be prepared. Okay, let me just go very quickly through this. The cost of the program, you might wonder, you know, is this, how are we going to do this? How are we going to require so many people to have background checks? It costs us about $30, a little bit more, Gary, now, but what we charge people to take the course is $30. And the conference picks up some of the others. And it depends upon whether the local church wants to pay or the individuals. At one point in time, individuals were required to pay. Some of the churches came along and said they're doing ministry and our church will pay. It varies from church to church, and we don't get involved in that part of it. We just collect the money. But churches decide how they want to be paid or not, you know, if they want to pay for it or they want their individuals to pay for it. I want to talk a little bit about the future, because one of the things that we're now seeing, I mean, I like to think that we're not cutting edge any longer, but that we're really up there and you know, kind of out there. And then all of a sudden things come along and you realize with technology today and with the young people and Twitter and Facebook and all these other things, online training is not anymore something that people don't talk about. I mean, our young people are used to online training all over the place. And so we are obviously, as many other conferences have done, talking about what would be the best way for Kansas or Kansas East, Kansas West, Nebraska. How are we all going to consider the next wave of the future? I think for us, it's a wonderful opportunity to see what's out there, to take best practices from a variety of places, and perhaps come up with a program that fits our conference, our people. One of the things that the holdouts that I've had and some of our people in the sexual ethics implementation team have had is, wow, the value of sitting down face to face and talking about these issues. You can't really put a price on that. The benefits of sitting through worker training and having people go through the process of healing themselves. Some of the people that have been sexually abused, if we talk about 1 in 3 and 1 in 5 or 7 boys, whatever the statistics are, we know that in our churches there are many people that are hurting and need to be healed. We get those people in our training classes. We see them. We can, I mean, you can sometimes feel the pain when you're teaching a worker class. And you can tell that people in that class are going through some stuff. What a wonderful opportunity face-to-face to be able to minister to them as well. You don't get that on an online course. And those are some of the things that we're struggling with. There are ways to get around even those kinds of things by having an online course and some additional face-to-face stuff. And I'm strictly talking here about worker training. I'm not talking about clergy sexual ethics training at all. I'm strictly talking about worker training. So we have a lot to learn. We're learning from one another. It's a privilege to be able to come here and learn from you and share with you and be open to some of your suggestions and comments as well.
And this is a much shorter section as we prepare to wind up and close. This has to do with a little bit more information in terms of sexual ethics and response team. Frank Pritz is our staff person that we had named earlier who heads that effort. We do have requirement for training. It was brought before the clergy sessions of both Kansas East and West, and we asked the clergy to vote a mandate on themselves for quadrennial sexual ethics training. And Frank Pritz leads an area committee that's putting together the next quadrennial training, which will occur conference year 11 and 12. And in fact, that mandate read in such a way that if some clergy person decides not to participate, it is an avenue for the bishop not to have to give them an appointment. And that's what the clergy voted. when this was brought before us. There is also annual training provided in new pastor orientation. Anytime someone brand new to the conference comes, whether it's transfer in from transfer from another denomination, new local pastor, new DSA, as a part of new pastor orientation, Frank provides basic sexual ethics training because we don't want them to wait till the next quadrennial training. It needs to be done the minute they walk in the door. Content of training, there's obviously a lot. These are just some highlights of some things that have been included, and because it's every 4 years, we do try to vary the content. Everything from traditional appropriate boundaries between pastors and parishioners. We've done a major focus on cyber safety based on some material I got from Paul O'Brien several years ago. We've done a segment on responding when you might discover you have a sex offender within your congregation. And we have an appropriate module and a set of policies about that on our website with guidance for any local church about a shepherding program, and borrowed that from a congregation in the Pacific Northwest with their blessing, and revamped it just slightly to fit the Kansas East Conference. Response when a concern is raised. And just want to highlight briefly, and that's one of the key things we want to talk about, is what is the role that Frank Pritz plays versus a DS. I know some of you have already talked that the DS is kind of the front line on this, and in our conference, the DS is not. We have chosen to delineate tasks between Frank Pritz, the conference consultant who heads the response team, and the superintendents. The DS, or the bishop, obviously is the first one to know that there is a crisis. You know the word that was used by Bishop Dick about an explosion, and that's certainly how it feels. I've been a DS. I've been there. I've done that 3 times. But Frank takes the lead, and part of the value, and let me just jump to this, role of the DS receives the report of the work of the consultant, and the response team works with the bishop to determine what appropriate steps and recommendations should be for the future. Advantages for this separation of duties. For us, we believe it's allowed the DS to maintain a more neutral position during the investigative phase. A difference in role of the person who interviews people who are involved versus the person who appoints. The DS is allowed, frankly, to focus more time on churches that show great potential for vitality and strength. Actually, when Bishop Jones arrived, he's given me permission to talk about this. He laughs about it now. He was concerned we had a staff position to deal with conflict because you get what you staff for. And that is a theory that can be true. But Kansas West doesn't have a staff person. Kansas East does. That sounds like a good science lab experiment. So does that mean Kansas West has none of these incidents because they have no staff person? No. And before we had a staff person, we had conflict aplenty. The issue is someone's going to spend time with it, significant time with it. And who is best equipped for that, and what do you really want your DS doing with the bulk of her or his time? And this is the choice we've made. That doesn't mean it's the right choice for you, but it is the choice we've made, and we wanted to share that. Follow-up, aftercare. Frank Pritz in his role also coordinates that. He does have a team of people that he calls on who bring various gifts to the table and can bring some of them in during the crisis itself in the investigative phase. Others of them come in for the aftercare phase, and Frank, or the consultant for pastoral and congregational concerns, guides that. He's actually the 3rd person appointed to sit in that role. Obviously, communication is key, and we've invited UMCOM to come in about every 4 to 5 years and do crisis communication training with all members of the extended cabinet, and to help us craft appropriate crisis manuals. I suspect most of you have been there and done that too. Last but not least, always the issue of privacy versus secrecy. or confidentiality versus secrecy. Much has changed in the life of the church. In the tenure when I was DS from 95 to 01, I went to boot camp at Lake Junaluska in 95, and we were told by the General Council of the United Methodist Church, you just can't say anything. And then about 2 years later, there was a change of heart, and we were all kind of invited back and said, well, you know, maybe that's not quite so. Maybe there are ways we could talk about the difference between confidentiality and secrecy in more creative ways that will maintain confidence where that is absolutely essential, but also allow bishops and district superintendents to communicate with congregants in such a way that there is greater opportunity for healing and wholeness in the life of every local church. And so that has been a key issue. We have tried to walk carefully with the guidance of our own conference chancellor and the General Council of the United Methodist Church. Nancy talked about our website where you can find things, kansaseast.org. There is a section of the website for safe and sacred space. You search for that on the top and you'll get there quickly. And sexual ethics is another key phrase to use in your search to find everything related to that.